is that the distinction that they talked about between joy and happiness is that happiness is often very dependent on circumstances, right? You know, I'm going to be happy if I, you know, eating that good meal, or if I get a good job, or I find my life partner, and actually joy is an internal state that is accessible at any time. Even in the face of, you know, and I tell you this amazing story that I heard from a mutual friend of Archbishop Tutu and mine. So she was actually in a Sudanese refugee camp with Archbishop Tutu, and one of the most bleak places on the planet, kind of similar to death row in Alabama in some way, in the sense of just a desperate, despairing place. And these were people who didn't know where their next meal was coming from. They didn't know if they were going to be attacked. They didn't know if their children or wives were going to be raped. And they're in this refugee camp, and Archbishop Tutu, as they're walking around the camp, starts to sing. And then the refugees started to sing with him. And then he started to dance, and the refugees started dancing with him. And later that night, my friend Shannon said to Archbishop Tutu, you know, hey Arch, you know, how can you possibly dance and sing in a place like this? And he said, Sister Shannon, it's not that I am not sad. It's that even when we are sad, we can choose to bring joy. Even, especially, now this doesn't mean, and I think he's not saying, you know, you deny the reality of your despair or your sadness. And it's not just, you know, kind of, don't worry, be happy. It's that even within those experiences of deep grief or deep suffering, you know, even when your back is broken, you know, there is choice in how we relate to those experiences. So the eight, shall I talk about the 8 pillars of joy?
Yes, please.
So there are 4 pillars of the mind and 4 pillars of the heart. And so the 4 pillars of the mind are perspective, humility, humor, and acceptance. And the way they relate to one another, it's interesting. Each of these are they're kind of like nested Russian dolls. You know, they kind of work with one another, or they build on one another. Excuse me. And so the first thing is perspective. It all starts with perspective, because, and this is kind of what we're talking about, of the choice, right? Which is, and they said, you know, it's really it's almost like stepping back within yourself and finding the proper perspective on whatever adversity or suffering you're experiencing in your life. Because it's so easy to get consumed by that suffering or that adversity and to kind of ruminate on it, and, you know, certainly, you know, my mind is a dog with a bone. And it's so easy to be in those places, and actually it's been very helpful to do the joy meditation practice in the book when I'm in those places, and it goes through the 8 pillars. And the first one is that perspective, and really stepping back and getting a larger perspective in terms of time and space, and realizing kind of where this fits in the overall scope of your life now and your life over time and the world, humanity, exactly.
The fact that you're a tiny speck in a tiny
right, exactly. So
in a big galaxy in the middle of absolutely nowhere, floating around.
And so exactly, and so that perspective is primary, and then from that perspective, you develop something that they both evidence so beautifully, which is this really profound sense of humility, the sense of your kind of place in the greater world and the greater cosmos. But it's really interesting because it's not a kind of nihilistic humility or even a kind of self-denigrating humility. It's a sense of you're kind of no better and no worse than anyone else, right? And that sense of kind of, which creates a kind of shared humanity, which allows you to break down these boundaries of race and class and to see yourself as connected with other people. And so that ability to have that humility leads to what the third pillar that they talked about, which is humor. which was just fantastic, you know, and they evidenced this, you know, Nikki was talking about, you know, the whole week, you know, they're cracking jokes and laughing, and they would be, you know, talking about these super moving things, and then they'd be teasing, and then they'd be laughing, and what humor does is it actually, you know, by being able to laugh at ourselves and our life, it kind of shakes, you know, us free of that rigidity. And, you know, it was really interesting because as I was down with Archbishop Tutu after we were in Dharamsala, and I said, you know, well, your humor isn't this kind of cutting humor, it's not a denigrating humor. And he said, no, it's really kind of like saying, come stand next to me and we'll laugh at me and then we'll laugh at you, you know. And, you know, that's what was so amazing in this week, was you see these two lofty spiritual masters and global icons who are really, you know, just, you know, hanging out with one of their buddies or mates, you know, and just like recognize, you know, using that same sense of humor to build relationship. And that's what we do with our friends, right? We're like teasing each other and ourselves, you know, kind of in that way of being like, aren't we all in the drink together? So that was humor. And then from humor comes acceptance, which was the acceptance of reality as it is. And what they talked about is that acceptance is not acquiescence, right? I mean, here are two global activists, right? Archbishop Tutu, you know, probably did as much as anybody to bring down apartheid. You know, he wasn't accepting apartheid. He was saying, but the chapter title is called Acceptance, the Only Place from Which Real Change Can Occur. And so it's accepting the reality of ourselves, you know, what our lives and our world, from which we can see reality clearly and what needs to be done. And so then those are the four pillars of the mind, and then from the four pillars of the mind we move into the four pillars of the heart. And the first pillar of the heart is forgiveness. And so when we accept reality as it is, we can actually, we can give up the longing for a different past. And we can stop, you know, kind of, you know, holding these grudges about what should have been and could have been, or self-blame, or blaming of others, and actually come to forgiveness. And one of the amazing things that Ray Hinton said, you know, when somebody asked him, I think it was on 60 Minutes, they asked him whether he had forgiven, you know, the people who had put him in jail for 30 years, and he said he had. And he said, I forgave them not so they can sleep well at night, but so I can sleep well.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, because otherwise you carry that story with you.
Exactly.
That's the theory,
What a good
right?
answer.
What's that?
That's the theory, right? But that's what you're supposed to do. But actually having done it, how do you know if someone is actually able to do it? You're always told, don't forget, you know, you don't have to forgive the person, the act, whatever, but you have to forget it for yourself. But actually, how do you prevent that? Saying, oh, we know I've done it, but you know, as soon as you think of the act again, whether it's your parents or whether it's something else that happened to you, you lost your job, you know, it sort of rises again. So you can bury it, but I don't know how you actually find out that you've actually really erased it. Yeah, but it's gone.
It's a great question. It's a really good question.
I think you pass through it though, rather than erase it.
Sorry?
I feel you have to pass through it.
You accept it.
Rather
For me, I
than
have to
erase
forget
it.
it. I mean, forget it literally, that it doesn't sort of keep coming back up every time you see that, you know, whether it's a job, or you see that, you know, somebody shows you, okay, whatever it is, the company name or a particular thing that's happened, you pass one of the shops that you may have been, you know, that's hard, but you can forget it. But I don't know if you can ever really forgive it.
But isn't it all connected?
I'm interested.
Forgiveness is very close to acceptance.
Yeah, I
Acceptance
think they're
is
very
also very close
Yeah.
to, what was the first one again?
perspective. Yeah.
Because if you distance yourself from
Yeah.
your own sins, someone else's sin, then you are able to accept them
Have
much
more.
better.
Yeah. They're kind of fractal. They all
So it's all
relate to.
connected
Yeah.
in the end.
Exactly. Yeah.
And it's not about the goal, it's actually what you do. I mean, whether it serves you or whether it serves
Right.
someone else, or it's about doing it.
Yeah. We worked with Archbishop Tutu on the Book of Forgiveness, which was another amazing book that we were interested even what you're describing, because it really actually works you through, it takes you through the fourfold path of forgiveness. And one of the things that I think they would talk about is, what he would say is, forgiveness is hard. When I asked, the only time I thought the Dalai Lama might actually hit me was when I asked him whether, what do you say to people who say that forgiveness is weakness? And he said, forgiveness is strength, 100%, 1,000%, and I could feel every one of those karate chops, and, Archbishop Tutu said, well, yeah, anyone who says that forgiveness is a sign of weakness hasn't tried it. And so I think, forgiveness isn't easy. It's quite hard, actually. But so forgiveness, fundamentally, I think what it's doing evolutionarily, right? So when we were researching this, there are, almost every culture has a form of forgiveness, and almost every culture has a form of retaliation. And basically, what you're doing is you're giving up the right of retaliation. You're saying, I am getting off the cycle of violence. So he talks about this cycle of violence and then the cycle of forgiveness, right? So it doesn't mean that that Ray Hinton doesn't still, get, he, whenever they're executing somebody in Alabama, it's a very hard night for him. And it's not that he doesn't ever have negative thoughts towards the people who incarcerated him. But it's this kind of, I think there is this quality, as you were saying, about, that forgiveness and acceptance in the sense of, he's no longer chained. Archbishop Tutu would talk about this metaphor of, you're being chained to somebody if you don't forgive them. And you can never really move forward or away from them, And so one of the final part of the fourfold path is either renewing or releasing the relationship. So you either create a new relationship with the person, or you let go of the relationship. But you can't do either if you're in unforgiving.
Interesting there. I remember the one question, sorry to interrupt you, he, just since you're accusing me of not telling you enough, the one wonderful question was when...
Such a poor memory.
When you asked the Dalai Lama, His Holiness, he said, how could you, or do you, or how could you, I can't remember whether, how could you, or how can you in that context forgive the Chinese for what they've done to people?
Yeah. That was really,
What did he say?
I've travelled extensively around Tibet.
Yeah.
And I have got cities
Yeah.
when I saw what they'd
Yeah.
pillaged and destroyed beautiful temples. I don't know, I just found it difficult. What did he say?
Well, so it was really, first of all, he was very refined in his.
It's a very politically orientated
course.
question. So
Well, right. So there is
There's
politics
a backdrop.
inevitably, but it was actually we went out to the world and we got 1,000 questions in about 3 days that we had to also include in all of our that we had to distill and.
Right.
And I'll tell you also, I can tell you about the question that
And you
the
had
most
to bring them in at the right time.
Yeah, exactly. That the most people asked of the question that most people asked. But so one of actually was like a 6th grade boy who asked whether he had forgiven the Chinese, and what he said was, first of all, he said so what we're talking about is some Chinese officials, right? So we're not talking about China and the Chinese. We're talking about some Chinese officials. And he said, he said that he had forgiven them. And he said, you actually can have compassion for them because their actions are creating very negative consequences. And it was just this amazing kind of flip of, now it doesn't mean that...
Who's the victim?
Who's the victim, right? Now, that doesn't mean that he's, but one of the things they were very adamant about forgiveness is doesn't mean forget. It doesn't actually mean, that you don't work with that person in a different way, or, be savvy about how you deal with the Chinese. But it is, again, it's, and he was very clear about that there's no being unforgiving doesn't actually allow him to be more effective in his life or dealing with the Chinese. So that was, that kind of acceptance and forgiveness. And then after forgiveness, the second, bubbles coming up as burps. The second pillar.
We're forgiven. You're forgiven, young man.
We're among friends here. We get
More human.
the second pillar of the heart is after forgiveness is gratitude. So once you've given up the wish for a different past, you can actually have gratitude for what is. And then from gratitude, once you have gratitude for all that you have, you come to compassion for those who don't have as much, or what you have, even if they have much in other ways. And so that compassion then ultimately leads to the final pillar of joy, which is generosity. And generosity is kind of compassion in action. It's like kind of how do you treat people with that compassion. And it was really interesting. It's of course generosity in your time and in your resources, and they have these different kinds of, in the Tibetan tradition, kinds of generosity of spiritual counseling, for example. But there's the term generosity of spirit, I think, is ultimately part of what they're talking about, which is the kind of summation of these 8 pillars. When you have these 8 pillars, you have a kind of generosity of spirit, which these 2 men evidence so incredibly. And one of the things they said was that, that joy, the fastest way to miss the bus is to chase after joy and happiness. If you...
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, sure.
I always hear the word happiness, and I feel very strongly that to be content is a wonderful thing to be. To be content, to be at peace with your life, with your friends, with your surroundings. It's funny because as I get older, I don't need to have these huge feelings of happiness or I see some of my friends still pursuing this total happiness. And yet I wonder if just being content, being at peace maybe, I don't know, maybe is that just a symbol of getting old, or is that a
Declining
hormones?
hormones?
Isn't there a big difference?